we're going to do a demo of WebSockets. So let me show you what we're going to build. It's very, very few lines of code. In fact, even though there's going to be some client-side code that's on here, we're not even going to use jQuery. We're going to, and part of the reason for this is that I don't want to muddy the waters at all. We're looking at a brand new technology, something we haven't looked at before. So let's just keep it nice and clean and simple. So this is what we're going to build here. Notice I could go in here. Now I'm just doing this with numbers. I set this up so this is a number input. So if I put in 300, you see that it shows up here. It also shows up here. On this side, if I put in, 201, these are just arbitrary numbers. You could imagine they're messages as well. You could see that this tells me, I did this. You could imagine creating some sort of chat application. The bottom line, how is this working? There are a number of ways that you could do this, but the way that we're going to look at is actually using WebSockets in order to do it. So let's actually set up a little project here. And what I'm going to do, let's go over here and I'm going to make a directory. I'm going to call this numbers app demo, and we'll cd into it. Okay. And so, you're right.
I'm sorry.
It's all right. So what we're going to do is create a very, very simplistic application here. Let's open up Vim. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a server.js file. This is going to be same stuff we've looked at all along, the basic Express application. The only difference with this from this Express application is we're going to set up the ability for a client to make WebSocket requests. In the end, what this is going to allow us to do is to have the client not only make a request to the server, but have the server actually make a request to the client. It's basically a two-way channel that we're going to create. And we'll go into a little bit more details of that when we end up looking at the slide. Here, I just want to give you a demo of how it ends up working. So we're going to go over here. This is going to be Express, require Express. And we'll go over here and we'll say app equals Express. And we'll go over here and we'll say app.get slash. And we're not even going to have a, what's called an engine, a template engine. We're just going to say response, send file, path.join. I'll need to bring that in. Directory name, index.html. Let's bring in path. And if we go over here, I'm going to start my server in a little bit of a different way. We've done this before too. What I'm going to do is say const server equals require HTTP server. And one of the ways that I could create a server is by giving it an Express app. Because again, a server needs to have routes that it deals with. So one of the ways you could create a server is going to be by doing this. Let's do our standard port. Process, environment, port, or 3000. And we'll tell our server to listen on our port. And we'll say console.log, listening on port. So if we go back and we run this, I think I'm going to find out that I don't have Express. Okay, so let's install it. Let's do npm init y npm install Express. save, and let's say npm node server JS, and let's go browse to this. If we browse to this, we'll find out that we don't have a file. We'll go in here, we'll put the file in. And here, real simple. Just do that. Should see that error message go away. Now, what we're going to use, although we could actually do it on our own, we're going to use a library called SocketIO that makes it a bit easier to make requests to the server. So what does that end up looking like? Well, the first thing that we want to do here is that we want our client to be able to make a WebSocket call to the server, okay? But in order to do that, we have to have the server listening for WebSocket calls. So the way that that ends up getting done is, first of all, I'm going to bring in SocketIO by requiring SocketIO. And let's go over here. And if I run this again, I'll find that SocketIO isn't there. npm install SocketIO save. So I'm going to run this again. Nothing really happens here. Let's go in and actually set up our socket. So the way that you end up setting up SocketIO is that if you have a server, you could create an I/O object which users can connect to. And the way that you do that is you specify a SocketIO, here's my server. And so what it's really doing here is it's actually now able to listen for requests that end up coming in here for a SocketIO request. Now, this in and of itself is not going to end up doing anything. But if I go over here and I specify IO, it uses what's called an event emitter syntax. So there's events that happen with IO. If a user goes to connect to this server, what'll happen is I could get in on the action by saying IO on connection. Okay? IO on connection. What ends up getting passed to this is the client socket. This is going to be an individual browser that has connected to this particular socket. So just for the sake of argument, if I go over here and I say console.log connected, and I go ahead and I run this, we're not going to see anything. It's interesting. Let me just see something here. A little bit weird. IO on connection. A little surprising. All right. Nevertheless.
I think it's because your browser refreshed. Did you install Path?
Say it again?
Did you install Path?
Yes. You don't have to install Path.
Oh, you don't?
No. Path comes along with territory. Let's do one thing over here. Let's go over here to our client. And this is going to seem a little bit weird. But what I'm going to actually do here, you're going to wonder where this came from, is I'm going to set the source to this script tag to SocketIO, SocketIO.js. Now you could look at that and wonder what that exactly means. Where am I getting this data from? If I go and open this up, and I go and I look at my network tab, I could go over here and look that I actually got a file. In fact, you can see that file is served from my server. Where did it come from? Well, when you end up installing SocketIO, what will happen is that a static route will end up getting put in that'll return this JavaScript file that I can then work with on the client. By the way, you could do a lot of this with native objects in JavaScript, but SocketIO is going to make it a little bit easier. So what do we want to do here? Well, what I'm going to do over here is if I do a console.log, I'm going to do this here on the bottom of my page to know that my DOM is loaded. If I go over here and I say console.log IO, and I go over here, this is actually an object that I'm getting from that script file, okay? And that's going to allow me to make a connection, a SocketIO connection to another server. Well, what do I want the connection to that server to be? Well, instead of doing console.log.io, let's say window.location.origin. Let's see what that is. That's our URL, okay? So we want to make a SocketIO connection to our socket that's sitting and listening on this server. So the way that we can do that is we can create a socket by specifying IO window.location.origin. Okay? Now when I end up doing this, we look at our console over here. I reload this page. You'll see that I'm connected. If I end up going and opening up another browser window, going over here, or even another browser, and do this again, I'll see that I'm connected again. Not only am I connected, but in fact, this socket, not that I'm going to need it, but if I go over here and I'll use my backtick because I'm on the server here, and I go over here, I'll specify, hey, socket, show me your ID. Every time the page ends up refreshing, a hard reload, it's going to end up reconnecting to this socket. It's also disconnecting when I end up closing the browser window, but I don't have to worry about that because SocketIO ends up taking care of that. So let me kill my server for a second. Notice I've got two browser windows opened. They were actually connected to the socket. Every time that I refresh, I'll see a new connection with a new ID. It's not something that you need to worry about, but if you could look at various tabs in, could probably look at them here under network, and there's a WebSocket. Every time I do that, I could see the WebSocket connection. And in fact, you could actually even see this ID that's over here is the ID that's over here. Again, you don't have to worry about how it's doing it, but what's happening is that there is a native object called a WebSocket. That WebSocket is being connected. Could be a WebSocket on another server. We happen to be doing it on our server. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to go over here and I'm going to put in on my page, let's just put an input here, and I'm going to give it an ID here. We'll just work with numbers, number input, type number, just for the sake of argument, okay? And what I'm going to do here, just so I know I can end up finding this, I'm going to specify input document get element by ID, and this is going to be number input. Just so I see I have it, I'll say console.log input. Go back here. I'll see that I can find that field. That's good. What I want to do is that since I have a socket, what I'm going to specify is, hey, look, input. What I want to do, jQuery does this under the covers, but I'm going to add an event listener to you. What do I want to listen to? Well, an input can change its value. If you go in there and you end up changing the value and you end up blurring out of it, this will end up getting called. And I'll go over here. I'm not even going to use my fat arrows because I want to get this. So I'll just, for starters, say console.log this. So if I put in a number and I tab out, I'll see that I've got my input. And in fact, I could actually just say console.log input.value. So not even using jQuery here. Reload this. It lets me do e because I think it thinks it's an exponent. So I could end up putting in a number here, and that'll end up working. Now, really what I want to do here is that when this ends up happening, I want to specify socket. So one of the things that a socket can do is that it can emit messages. These are what event listeners are. Event listeners say, hey, look, you can emit something, and you could also listen for things as well. A socket has the ability to emit, and we have the ability to give a name as to what type of message we're emitting. I'm going to emit number added is going to be my function, and this is going to be my input.value. Nothing really is going to happen here. If I go over here, I put in a number, I tab out of it, I'm not going to see any error message at all. Not going to see any error messages on the server, okay? But if I go back to the server, I've got my socket that ended up connecting. So I could specify, hey, look, socket. If this socket ends up emitting a message, number added, okay? I could go over here and put in a function, and I could get that number. So it's two-way communication. There's a socket that's connected to the server, and I could specify, hey, look, on some event, okay, I want to listen for it, and I'll go over here and say console.log number. Go back here. Let me restart my server. Let me reload my page here. And notice what's going to happen here. Tab out of that. I'll see it gets my number. Gets my number. Same token, if I went over here, I'm connected now. There's another socket that's in existence here. I go over here. I see that ends up showing up as well. Now, what I want to have happen is that when something happens over here, and this always gets to be a little bit confusing, but what it comes down to is that what I want to do is that there's a number of sockets that are connected to this server. When this socket ends up emitting an event, what I want to do is I want to let all the other sockets that are out there, I want them to be aware of this. So what I could end up doing here is that I could go up to my server, and what I'll do is that when a number ends up getting added, I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to simply say IO emit, and I could really call this whatever I want to call this. Even if I end up calling it number added, that's perfectly legitimate. It doesn't really matter. And I'm going to end up, what I'm looking at here is I want to broadcast out to the rest of the world, whoever is listening, that I've actually added this number. So I'm going to go back to my index page, and I'm going to take this socket, again, two-way communication, socket on, number added, let's just see if this works, console.log number. So what should happen here is that if this is working, what should happen is that when I end up putting a number in, it should echo not only to me, but to everybody else who's listening as well. Let's make sure I didn't end up screwing this up. So let's go back here. Let's go back here. Let me open up my console here as well. I'm going to put in a number. Should echo back to me, and it echoes back to this guy too, right? And it echoes back to this guy too. Now, the fact of the matter is that if I ended up sending this message, why should it echo back to me? I sent it, right? I know what the message is because I just sent the message. So what I want to do here is that I'm going to modify my server code. And one of the things that you can do with a socket is a socket, again, this is again SocketIO. I could say, hey, look, socket broadcast. What broadcast will do is broadcast will emit to every other socket except me. Okay? So if there's 3 sockets that are there, it'll end up emitting to the other 2 that are connected. Let's see if this works. Run this again. Go back here. I'm going to reload this. I'm going to reload this. What that means is that I should be able to do this and not see it here. Do this, not see it here, but I'll see it in these other windows. Again, if you wanted to see, make sure it only works for more than 2 of these. I'm sure you would believe me. But just to see. So here, if I do this one, I don't see it here, but I see it in these other 2. Now, just to complete the UI, this is really almost the end of this lesson, but just to complete the UI, what I'm going to do is modify this code here. And what I'm going to do is put in an unordered list, give it an ID of my list. And without even using jQuery, when this ends up changing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify list equals document get element by ID, my list. And I'm going to specify that the list inner HTML, this is something you could do without jQuery, list.inner HTML plus equals, and I'll put in a list item, and I'm going to specify me because this was my message. Let's use my backticks here. And I'll say $, input.value, li, close that up. And just for the sake of argument, let's also specify that the input value is going to now be an empty string. So let's now go over here. What this should do, if I put in 99, it should say me 99 and clear this out. And what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to go back over here to number added. I'm going to cheat by doing a little copying and pasting. Again, this is messy code, but this is a new concept. Didn't want to bring in Webpack and that sort of thing at this point. Here, this is just going to be input.value. Again, without having to go and restart the server. If I do this, I put in 10. That's me. And here, this is not input.value. This is number. So now, reload these guys, put in 10. You can see it shows up here. 11, that's me, it shows up here. Reload this, 50, shows up on both these. That's basically the concept, or what I should say, not the concept. That's how you could end up setting up WebSockets. Again, there's some native ways to do this, but if you did that, you might have to keep track of when WebSockets end up getting disconnected and that sort of thing. And what's happening here that's nice is that SocketIO is under the covers doing your work for you. So when you end up saying socket.broadcast emit, right, it ends up basically just looking at the sockets that are currently connected, and it only ends up emitting to those. But again, this gives us the ability to have two-way data flow. What you're able to do here is to have changes that are happening on the server and push those changes to the client. Let me stop this recording so it doesn't get too long.